So welcome, Ralph. Ralph, you President Emeritus and WSD Honda Chair in Peace Studies. You've been at Pacific Forum for a very long time. Delighted to have you here to talk about Taiwan and U.S.-Taiwan relations, in particular the dialogue that you ran a couple of years ago, of which there were 2 iterations. But before we start diving into the specifics of that dialogue, maybe can you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself as well as the work you've done over the years, not just on Taiwan generally, but on Taiwan specifically as well.
Sure. Well, thank you, David. As you mentioned, I've been at Pacific Forum for a long time. I've really only had 2 employers for the last 60 years or 58 years, U.S. Air Force for 27 years, and then since 1992, Pacific Forum. First as executive director, then as president, and now, of course, as president emeritus. I certainly have a great deal of love for Pacific Forum. I started with Admiral Joe Vasey, our founder. I worked with Amos Jordan and Jim Kelly, and then my successor. So it's been a great run. Continuing the work sort of part-time, primarily doing projects dealing with China, Taiwan, and with North Korea. You know, my work on China and Taiwan goes back many years. I was part of the earlier National Committee on American Foreign Policy, so-called shuttle diplomacy between Beijing and Taipei back in the 90s with Don Zagoria and Bob Scalapino, and also ran what we call the Arlington process with Rich Armitage and Joe Nye and others working on U.S.-Taiwan relations. Even did a U.S.-Taiwan-Japan trilateral years ago, trying to improve ties informally, unofficially among those 3 countries. And of course, I've done a lot of work on North Korea, and I'm actually coming to you live from South Korea today. I'll be keynote speaker at a conference tomorrow celebrating the Camp David Accords, the first anniversary of the trilateral meeting, which sort of something I've worked on for a long time with my book back in the 1990s on building a virtual alliance among the 3. So I've spent a long time working on Asia essentially since 1969, and I'm thankful I can continue to do it.
Well, very good. Thank you. When I hear 1969, I wasn't born there. So, so this is actually,
don't remind me.
No, but it shows how much experience you've got. So this is great. So delighted to have you do this this presentation. So I'll be asking you just a few questions specifically on Taiwan. But if you want to get into go a little broader as well, so long as it relates to Taiwan and U.S.-Taiwan relations, please feel free. The first question I have is really on the dialogue that you set up in 2021, and basically ask you why you decided to launch that dialogue. Why did you feel that there was a need to launch that process? Why you focus on deterrence and defense? And then why specifically at the track 2 level? Why do you think that it's important that we have that at the non-official level?
Well, great, David. Great opening questions. I think if we think back to 2021, which seems like a lifetime ago in the middle of COVID and everything else, but this was when the Chinese, the PLA, were just starting to increase their aggressive behavior around Taiwan, starting to agree that to increase their capabilities to conduct kinetic action against Taiwan. And there was a big debate in the United States on whether or not Taiwan was prepared to defend itself and whether it was even willing to defend itself, and how seriously Taiwan took the China threat. So that was sort of the basis, the incentive for us bringing a group of Taiwan scholars and Taiwan officials and U.S. scholars and officials, the latter in their private capacity at the track 2 level, just because it was sensitive then, as it is now, to talk about defense cooperation between U.S. and Taiwan. But I felt that it was really needed, that we needed to have a better understanding of each other's concerns, each other's capabilities, and whether or not what we were doing made sense in the broader issue of defense and deterrence. Obviously, deterrence is what we would prefer, but we have to be ready to defend ourselves if deterrence fails.
Good. So I guess the goals were try and strengthen deterrence and make sure that it works. And then if it doesn't, be able to defend the island. So the dialogue itself was really primarily about this.
Yeah, and one of the goals, quite frankly, was to raise awareness both in the United States and in Taiwan to A, the Chinese threat, B, the need to do something about it, and C, how seriously both sides were looking at this or should be looking at it if they weren't.
Right, right. Well, that makes sense. And so I guess, how do you and by extension, most of the dialogue participants, what did you learn, or how did you assess not only the odds of the so-called China threat, but also the odds specifically of what many people have identified as the primary risk, which is a full-scale invasion of the island? Where did you come out on that?
David, I mean, you mentioned that we did two iterations of the dialogue. We had one in 2001 and one in 2002, or 2021 and 22. A world of difference between the two dialogues. And that difference could be spelled out in one word, and that word was Ukraine. During our first dialogue, Americans were talking about the need for homeland defense, and Taiwanese sort of listened politely, but I don't think they were quite there. The idea that China would really attack, that this kind of warfare was still possible in the 21st century, I think a lot of people on both sides sort of dismissed. Ukraine was a real wake-up call in this regard, and during our second meeting, there was a great deal more emphasis on homeland defense, on developing the kind of capabilities to deal not only with an all-out invasion, but also with the so-called gray zone activities, which were increasing. And of course, we saw with the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan and then the major Chinese exercise shooting missiles over the island, that there was in fact a serious threat that we needed to be dealing with and taking seriously. And I think that the combination of the PLA exercises and the Russian invasion of Ukraine were a real wake-up call, I think, for both sides, that we needed to take things a little more seriously. We needed to have a serious discussion. And I think that's why I would say the second meeting was probably more productive, more down in depth, more focused on actual needs and capabilities, because the reality of the threat was much greater.
It's funny to realize how much Ukraine has changed the way we see the world. Certainly in the case of Taiwan, but then throughout, we've completely changed the way we approach international relations and realize that geopolitics really is back in ways that maybe in the West we've forgotten, and beyond the West, I've forgotten a little bit to our displeasure. But I wonder is after the 2021 iteration and 2022 iteration, would you say that Taiwan's defense choices and priorities, would you consider them fit for purpose and in sync with what the United States is doing to try and make sure that deterrence works? Or do you think that there are still gaps in the way the island and then the United States see the situation?
I mean, first of all, David, there are always gaps. You can never be 100% prepared, and certainly I would say we're much closer to that today than before. You have the same thing in both countries where militaries are fascinated with big ticket items, so everyone wants to have the latest tank and the latest fighter aircraft and the latest ship. but I think we tried to focus a lot on what was called large numbers of small things, having the kind of anti-ship capabilities, the anti-air capabilities, the air-to-surface capabilities that could help defeat or delay a Chinese maritime assault on the island. Pre-positioning of supplies, having logistics train and set. There are a lot of things, that we have promised Taiwan as far as military hardware is concerned, but you take a look and some of them are 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the pipeline. And I think we also understand the vulnerabilities. Things that are on the island could very well be destroyed in the first round of fighting. So you need to have hardened facilities. You need to have pre-positioned supplies elsewhere. You have, a lot of things that go into that. Also, as you provide new weapon systems, you've got to provide the kind of training with it. We're seeing again, this is a lesson in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians want, every weapon known to man, but many of them they wouldn't have a clue how to use. So you've got to also, after you make the decision to give them the weapon, then you've got to make sure you have the training in place. And that's a long process. Are we there yet? No. Are we closer now than we were 3 years ago? Yes. Are we more aware of the need to get closer yet? Yes. And that's, I think, the real important factor. And I think one of the contributions of our series of conferences was that it raised the awareness, it raised the sense of urgency, if you will, in both countries, and helped to sort of stimulate the process of getting prepared.
Yeah, it's funny because that's my sense as well, not just about this particular problem set, but even throughout the Indo-Pacific and beyond, we are much better off in terms of strengthening deterrence today than we were a few years ago. So progress has happened. What I worry about is whether it's happened fast enough, and it feels that it hasn't yet. I mean, to me, that's how I see the primary challenge in the Indo-Pacific, probably even more than in other theaters, because of course you've got an active war in Europe, you've got trouble, active trouble in the Middle East as well, and so it feels like the Indo-Pacific is always last. And so I worry, even though we're making progress is not happening fast enough. And I don't know, would you say that this is the primary thing that is keeping you awake at night?
Yeah, well, the point is that if you read the national security strategy from certainly from this administration, but even from the one before that, it's clear that China is now the, quote, pacing challenge. We've identified that the greatest threat to U.S. national security interests is coming from China, not just against Taiwan, also in the South China Sea, and also, quite frankly, on the Korean Peninsula. And certainly the Chinese have not done a very good job of keeping the North Koreans in check. They've been much more aggressive and hostile, and certainly developing their own capabilities. Which raises the possibility of a two-front war in Asia in the future. A great concern of mine, what I probably do lose sleep over, is are we prepared if there's an attack on the Korean Peninsula and China decides that this provides an opportunity to go against Taiwan, or there's an attack against Taiwan and North Korea says, oh, this would be a good time to go south. And, are we prepared to deter and defeat in a two-front Asian war? And I think that's something that we still need to look at. In peacetime, you're never going to be totally prepared, but you need to at least be aware of the challenge. I think we are. I think we've raised awareness of the dual threat here now. And that's the first step toward, taking the right steps to address the challenge.
I mean, to complicate it even further, you could say that if something happens in Asia with China, North Korea, then something else could happen even more in Europe or in the Middle East. So you could have like something global, not even just regional. So we are,
actually, yeah,
in many ways, in not a good place. The security environment regionally, but even globally, is really tense.
And we are, the world's only real global power, and we have responsibilities in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Europe. So it creates a challenge, and that's why it's so important to have readiness, to have preparations, and to have the kind of interoperability, have the type of familiarity with one another's military capabilities, so that we can operate together if we need to.
Right. And so specifically on that point, I remember in the 2021 dialogue, Americans say, you're facing a big threat to the Taiwanese, and the Taiwanese saying, well, we are already we feel we're already being attacked, and we worry more about gray zones, and you guys seems to worry more about the sort of high level intensity war that, yes, we care about as well, but really we are already at war, and so you could tell that there was, some almost discrepancy between the two views. Would you say that this is still not a problem, but certainly a different ways of seeing the problem set?
Well, I think there's still sort of a debate more within the United States than in Taiwan about, whether we need to focus on gray zone or whether we need to focus on an invasion. I mean, from a military planner's perspective, you always focus on the worst case. If you're prepared to deal with an all-out invasion, then you're certainly better prepared to deal with lesser acts and gray zones. But you can't ignore the gray zones, and this is where I think some American analysts who say we need to really just focus on the major war that may not occur. The Chinese, going back to Sun Tzu, have said the ideal is to win without fighting. And certainly the gray zone tactics aimed at demoralizing as well as at threatening are part of that tactic. So we need to be able to deal with that. Psychological warfare, disinformation. This is something that we're sort of attuned to right now as we're in the middle of a U.S. election period and social media is going crazy. People are lying, you just know who's lying and what they're lying about. So it creates a great deal of challenge. But Taiwan is under that constant barrage. I mean, one of the conclusions from both of our reports was Taiwan is already under attack. We can't talk about the future attack. We need to recognize that economically, politically, socially, psychologically, and even militarily through the gray zone activities, Taiwan is bombarded daily by the PRC, actions that are aimed at demoralizing, at weakening their resolve. Surprise, surprise, has had just the opposite effect. And this is something I don't think the Chinese have quite understood. I've written in the past about Xi Jinping being tactically clever but strategically foolish. When he does his missile launches over Taiwan, it may send a message to the Taiwanese that, hey, we can reach out and touch you. But it also reminds Taiwan and it reminds the rest of the world that we need to be coming to Taiwan's defense and improving those capabilities. Just as their actions against Taiwan or against Hong Kong have opened up a lot of eyes about, just how good the Chinese are at treaties and keeping their word, and how irrelevant systems is to solving either Hong Kong or Taiwan.
Right. So, okay, so that's the sort of gray zone aspect. In terms of, I guess, the next strengthening agenda for the United States and Taiwan, as you well know, deterrence, to really be effective, has to be visible. We have to see what we're doing. It's a little bit difficult at the gray zone level to counter coercion at the gray zone level, but also in the sort of high-end scenario to decide what it is that we will reveal to show that we strengthening deterrence, as opposed to what we want to keep under wraps, just because you can't reveal everything. And so how do you see the balance? What would be the right balance? What should we advertise? Which should we show? And then what should we keep secret?
Yeah. Well, it's a delicate it's a delicate question. I mean, first of all, we have to realize that the Chinese are watching. You don't have to tell the Chinese that we're transiting the Taiwan Strait. They see it, they know it, the message is there. If you do it quietly, then the Chinese get the message, but they don't feel like they have to react. If you start broadcasting it, then they have to protest, they have to say something, and then it just sort of, spirals on down. So it's more important that we demonstrate capabilities quietly than we talk about them. And certainly we've for many years been what we call training the trainers, bringing Taiwan military to the United States to learn how to use the various systems. There's some talk now about U.S. trainers on the ground in Taiwan. I hope that's true. I hope they're there, but I don't think we should be talking about it or broadcasting it. The Chinese know it. So, let's just leave it at that. I think it raises the broader question, David, about strategic ambiguity. And I've always thought it was sort of a silly debate. The United States does not need to come out and say, we will defend Taiwan at all costs. If we were to say that, then you start getting a debate in the Congress over whether the president can say that or whether the Congress has to say it, and we end up shooting ourselves in the foot. You then get other countries being asked, how are you going to respond, et cetera, et cetera. It creates a lot of problems. The reality is no sane Chinese strategic planner today can factor the U.S. out. When they talk about conducting military operations against Taiwan, they have to assume that the United States is going to be involved. So the only question is, how will the United States be involved? What will the U.S. be doing? We, I think, coined a phrase in our report in 2022 that we need strategic ambiguity, but operational clarity. What do I mean by that? I mean, if the Chinese assume that the U.S. is going to be involved, then we need to convince them that we are capable of being involved in a way that can deter them and defeat them. So we need to be holding military exercises. We need to hold a big exercise on defending the island of Okinawa. That's a big island with a lot of people. Oh, by the way, so is Taiwan. We need to be conducting exercises as we're doing now, joint combined exercises, multinational exercises, where aircraft are taking off and landing on highways in Taiwan or highways in the Philippines to demonstrate that even if bases are destroyed, there's a way to continue conducting air operations. So this is what I mean by operational clarity. They need to understand that we know how to deal with amphibious assault. They need to understand that we know how to deal with airfields being put out of commission, these type of things, so that when they factor us in a way that is more emblematic of our capabilities and what they might face. The more they understand that, the more deterrence works.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. To me, strategic clarity would, in fact, lock us in a situation you don't want to be. I mean, why would you make a choice even though you can demonstrate clarity operationally? So I, very much agree. I guess the follow-on question to that is: do you think that we will remain, that policy will remain, that policy of strategic ambiguity will remain? Or do you foresee a change going forward?
Well, I think it'll remain. Now, we already know that on several occasions, President Biden, when asked, would you defend Taiwan, has said, of course. And then, the State Department says what the president meant to say is, and certainly if Donald Trump were to become president again, all bets are off as far as what he might say in the middle of the night during a tweet. But I think that in any case, there would then be what the president meant to say corrections. And anytime policy changes, the first thing we do is try to assure everyone that policy has not changed. And I think we would see that. So I don't I don't see the benefits, and I see a lot of downsides to going away from strategic ambiguity. And as I said, the main thing is it's not ambiguous in the Chinese mind. The Chinese have to assume that we are going to get involved and that we're going to get involved in a big way. In fact, they also have to assume that Japan will somehow or other be involved, since it's a great threat to Japan if China were to take over Taiwan, as a study that you and I were involved in certainly demonstrated. So, we don't have to remind them of that. They already know, and they're already factoring that in.
Good. How about nuclear weapons? So this is, as you know, a topic that at Pacific Forum we address quite a bit. We've done a lot of work on nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction. But in that context, how much do nuclear weapons matter? And how much do nuclear weapons matter to Taiwan, specifically the U.S. nuclear policy and posture? And of course, and this is also something we've discussed quite a bit, China is engaged in what many have characterized a crash nuclear buildup.
Yeah.
How is that changing the situation? And essentially, where are we going? Are nuclear weapons going to matter more in that context?
Yeah, it's a very sensitive question, David, and it's a very nuanced question, as you well know. I don't think any Taiwanese is hoping that it'll get to the point where the U.S. needs to use nuclear weapons on Taiwan territory in order to deter the Chinese. That's sort of a lose-lose right there, regardless of whether you win or lose. And I think that the likelihood of nuclear weapons being used over a Taiwan incident is probably fairly low. I'm much more concerned on the Korean Peninsula, and I'm much more concerned about Kim Jong-un seeing it as a last resort weapon if he starts something and then sees that he's losing badly. So I worry more about there. But the real concern, I think, in the Taiwan context is whether or not we see nuclear blackmail. Whether it's the right conclusion or not, an awful lot of people have concluded that the reason why NATO is not more active in supporting Ukraine is because of Putin's nuclear saber rattling. I think there are other reasons beyond his nuclear saber rattling, and I'm not sure how serious people actually take that, but there is certainly a perception that nuclear saber rattling has kept the U.S. from putting boots on the ground. Well, if that's the case, then maybe Chinese nuclear saber rattling, or just the fact that China is a nuclear power, could keep the U.S. from being directly involved in a conflict on the Taiwan. So that, I think, is the real concern, and whether or not the people of Taiwan are concerned that the U.S. won't come to their aid because we've demonstrated in Ukraine that we will not go to war against a country with nuclear weapons. So I think that's where the real nuclear nuance is, if you will, and why, quite frankly, I mean, again, the Taiwan thing to the other, I think we ought to be giving Ukraine a hell of a lot more. I think we ought to be calling Putin's bluff in Europe. Because were he to actually expand the war against NATO, it would be all over for Russia in a matter of days, and they certainly know it. They the Russian military can't even handle the Ukrainian military. Imagine if NATO were to put boots on the ground. So I think we allow ourselves to be spooked by Putin, and the sort of trickle-down effect of that is people in Taiwan and in Japan and in Korea and elsewhere worrying that maybe U.S. extended deterrence won't be real if in fact it's a nuclear adversary that we're dealing with.
Yeah, it's interesting because at that particular dialogue, what we heard is that the Taiwanese worry more about US inaction than about the potential for nuclear escalation. And so I think that is to exactly the point you made, which is
exactly
what the perception is. Again, I don't think that this is what we were doing, but certainly this is how it was received by regional allies. And so, I mean, it is a problem. It's also very difficult to manage because you don't want to sort of also risk nuclear escalation, but you want to do enough so that extended deterrence remains credible in the eyes of allies. It's you know it's going to be probably even more difficult as the Chinese are building up their arsenal.
And you know, I have to acknowledge, I mean, this is the great thing about being in a think tank, David, is that we can make these bold statements about, you know, well, we got to call Putin's bluff, et cetera, et cetera. And one time in my military career, I used to be a military planner. You know, when you made decisions then, people's lives were at stake, real lives really at stake. So obviously, when you're making decisions that involve real lives and you have the ability to affect those or put those at risk, it's a lot tougher than when you're sitting up in think tank heaven, you know, just talking about it in theory.
Although I'm pretty sure that if we get into a hot war, Hawaii would be targeted, and we sitting in Honolulu at Pacific Forum would suffer from it. But I do take your point in terms of talking about these issues as opposed to actually making decisions.
That's why I have my fallback place up in the Adirondack Mountains, David. They'll never even find it up there.
I'm sure New York would be targeted as well, but yeah. Well, good. How about I mean, you mentioned Japan and Japan's interest in doing more for Taiwan, and in the dialogue, I remember us talking about internationalizing the problem. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that a little bit. What does that mean? What is it that we can do moving forward? And you know, maybe just an assessment of the progress that has been made so far.
Well, I think internationalization is an important aspect of deterrence. If the Chinese are convinced that going against Taiwan means they're going against the United States, that provides deterrence. If they're convinced it means also going against Japan and Australia, and it also means that Europeans are going to take action against China, not only militarily, but economically and politically, that also enhances deterrence. So, and the more you raise awareness of the problem, I think the more significant it is. You know, what's happened in the last year or two should be a wake-up call to the Chinese. Again, you know, this tactically clever, strategically foolish leader may not be picking up on these signals, and I'm not sure there are a lot of Chinese analysts who are willing to go in and say, "Hey, boss, you know, you're really screwing up in what you're doing." You know, that could be a career, would not be career enhancing to do those type of things. But it's significant to note that if you go back 2 or 3 years ago and look at NATO statements, you never saw a reference to China. Now you see references to China, and you see references to the importance of stability across the Taiwan Strait. You look at 2+2 pronouncements from the U.S. and Japan, U.S. and Korea, U.S. and Australia, U.S. and the Philippines, elsewhere. It's almost automatic now that there'll be a line in there that talks about the importance of stability across the Taiwan Strait. That's a reminder to the Chinese that this isn't just between you and Taiwan, and it's not just between you, Taiwan, and the U.S., but the rest of the world is watching, and certainly Chinese support for Russia in Ukraine was a real wake-up call. Chinese abrogation of the basic agreement on Hong Kong was a huge wake-up call, not only in the UK but throughout Europe. And certainly, you know, what they've been doing now elsewhere in Southeast Asia is a wake-up call, not just to the Filipinos, but to all the Southeast Asians, and certainly anyone with a claim in the South China Sea.
Yeah, you know, I completely agree, and I will tell you, I was in Europe twice this summer, and every meeting, people wanted to talk about China and Taiwan, what it means, what is it that we need to know, what is it that we can do, how should we go about it, and so there's it's still a learning curve in Europe, but it's certainly a very, very omnipresent problem in their minds. And just next month, I'm going to be teaching a course on China for NATO, requested by NATO allies, so that they can actually figure out what the alliance can do, because that language being added. I also say that even if you don't have statements by some countries about Taiwan, behind the scenes, they're also asking questions. So what we see in the statements of those, multiple countries, in many ways, that's the tip of the iceberg. It's become very, very much global. And so that's certainly, hopefully, will help enhance deterrence.
Yeah.
So maybe just following on to that, do you think, would you say that in the United States, the US public certainly knows more about Taiwan and China, but like, where are we as a nation if we were to get into a situation where there's a very serious crisis and potentially a conflict? How do you expect the US public to deal with this?
Well, again, an important question, David, and you'll recall when we first started this discussion, I said one of the purposes of our dialogue was to raise awareness in the United States. Certainly, and it's no reflection of just our work, but obviously, China awareness of the China threat has certainly grown in the U.S. The two political parties right now are falling over one another to say who was tougher on China, to the point of sometimes, I think, being foolish and counterproductive. But certainly, I think there's an awareness. And China heavy-handedness, when the Chinese arrest Canadian diplomats and Canadian businessmen and all, for essentially political hostage taking, this raises concerns. When they fly reconnaissance balloons over the United States, balloons that are too big to miss, this is again raises awareness. But I mean, and if I can engage in a little shameless self-promotion, you and I wrote a report entitled "When Taiwan Falls," which is not predicting that Taiwan will fall, but says if it does, here are the consequences, and not just for the United States, but for Japan, for Korea, for India, for Europe, elsewhere, Australia. And I think it's a very important study. I think the Taiwanese hint, I'd probably be playing Pacific Forum to go around the different cities, not only in the US, but also in Japan and in Korea and elsewhere, giving a briefing on that study, because I think it really does raise people's awareness of what the implications are. So what? How does it affect me? Well, it will affect you a great deal. It will affect you in the price of everything you pay for. It will affect you in the credibility of our alliances and being sucked into conflicts elsewhere. So, I think there's a greater awareness now at the sort of the macro level of China as a threat. But I think there's not a very nuanced understanding of just what that threat constitutes and what we need to do to respond to it, to deal with it. And I think that's where our effort needs to lie today.
Yeah, in some ways, that process should continue or should resume, because it's still, again, we've seen progress, but we're not where we need to be yet. So there's more work that needs to happen. On that study that you mentioned, my sense was that we've seen in the United States a lot of exercises and scenario as to whether, if we get into a war, who would win and how. But no one had actually done a study on what happens if we lose, regardless of how we lose. If we lose,
Yeah.
Those are the consequences. And that's actually helpful to say, for people to realize that, well, actually, no, things would be really, really bad if we lose. And so that's why, again, deterrence matters as a result.
Yeah, David, and that's, I think, a very important point that needs to be stressed. I mean, people spend too much time talking about and wringing their hands about the results of war games. I've been in hundreds of war games, both in uniform and since then, political military simulations. The games are only as good as the assumptions. And you don't build a game that guarantees that you're going to win. If you win every time you do a war game, it means you're not doing it right, and you're not learning anything. The old saying on war games is to lose is to learn, and to learn is to win. So you're better off losing in the war games, because then you're identifying the weak spots and addressing it, so that when the real situation occurs, you won't lose. So, Taiwan, China can take Taiwan in 3 days. Well, that's nonsense. It's only under certain scenarios and under certain assumptions that are built in that allows China to do that. In the real world, that doesn't happen, and it's not likely to happen. And we shouldn't spend so much time agonizing over the results of war games. What we need to be doing is learning from them, learning why we lost this or why we lost that, or how do we not lose the next time.
Would you say that we are learning, that all these exercises that we're doing are bearing fruit?
Yeah, no, I think we are now. The part of the problem, of course, when we conduct these sophisticated pal mill simulations, I'm sure the Chinese are watching them too and trying to learn from them as well. But we have a unique ability, I think, in the U.S., and this is something that really came home to me when I was on active duty. After every exercise, we would have a hot wash, and we would sit there and say, okay, what could we have done better? This wasn't aimed at criticizing the commander. It wasn't aimed at getting somebody fired. It was aimed at the understanding that no matter how well you do, you can always do things better. There are always going to be, blockades, roadblocks that you need to deal with. I was at a very interesting conference, U.S.-China conference that Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, ran a number of years ago, focused on the EP3 incident. And he brought in people who were involved in it, decision makers from both sides. And on the U.S. side, we could come up with a long list of things that the U.S. could have done better, and a long list of things China could have done better. On the Chinese side, they couldn't think of a single thing they could have done better, because that would have been criticizing the leadership, and you can't do that. So I think one of our real strengths is, quite frankly, our ability to criticize, our ability to do lessons learned, to look at something and say, here's what we did wrong. But if you start out with the premise that the other guy did everything wrong and you did everything right, then you're just deluding yourselves and you're not learning. I hope there's more realistic assessments being done in China behind closed doors, but certainly the ones that they do with us, it's rare to hear a Chinese say, well, we could have actually done A, B, and C, and that would have been smarter.
And even beyond exercises, sometimes you hear we sort of self-criticize, say, well, the United States could have done better here vis-a-vis what you're doing. But the Chinese really very rarely say, well, yes, we recognize that our actions are also triggering those consequences. And that's a flaw, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the default position with China is it's America's fault. All of this was caused by American bad behavior or American duplicity. So, to say, well, Xi Jinping's policies were so stupid that they backfired on us, is something you're not going to see written in any Chinese journals.
Right, right. Well, so how about the future? I mean, I know you have been skeptical about the Chinese actually being able to take Taiwan. You've always stressed in your writings and presentations that this is actually something that's very difficult to do. So is it still your opinion right now? And then are you worried, as many people are, that as we progress into the 2020s, that this will change and could change in ways that we don't want to, that would not benefit the United States?
Yeah. Do I worry? Yes. What do I worry about? I'm more worried about an accident getting out of control than I am a deliberate decision to start a war. But we had an interesting discussion on all of this at the Asia Roundtable last year, and I was asked, "Is war inevitable between the U.S. and China?" And my answer was no, but it's no longer unthinkable. It's no longer so unlikely that it doesn't make any sense to talk about. And the reason why is because I think Xi Jinping has been very reckless. He's doing things against a U.S. ally in the Philippines that could force us to respond. And as I tell my Chinese colleagues, it's never wise to test a U.S. president, but it's particularly unwise to test him during an election year. And that's where we are right now. So, it just doesn't make sense to be playing Russian roulette out in the South China Sea with Philippine resupply missions, because this is an accident waiting to happen. And we won't be as lucky as we were during the EP3 incident, where we were able to walk it back, despite it, I think, creating a lot of lasting animosity, which we're still dealing with today. So I've also argued that Xi Jinping doesn't need to recapture Taiwan to become president for life. He's already got the job. The only thing that could cause him to lose that job would be to try to take Taiwan and fail. So, is he willing to risk going down in history as the Chinese leader that lost Taiwan permanently? Because that's the stakes that are involved if you try to take Taiwan permanently, as you also could lose it permanently. And the end result would be Taiwan as an independent country. One China fig leaf goes away, and the Chinese leader that brings that about lives in perpetual disgrace. So that's something I think we need to continue writing about, continue reminding our Chinese colleagues and reminding Xi Jinping that his legacy is at stake in a lot of different ways. And one of those is to start something against Taiwan that could end up resulting in Taiwan independence, exactly what he doesn't want, but could also result in the destruction of the Chinese economy and setting the Chinese nation back 100 years. And that serves no one's interest, and certainly not China's.
I mean, and in addition to this, China has a lot of worries beyond Taiwan.
Yeah.
And we all know that economically, it looks like China is not doing really well as before. Yeah. So there are other things that Beijing probably should focus on besides that. So, well, very good. I mean, I guess the last question would be: do you see? Well, we've talked a little bit about this in the context of strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity, but do you see a change in approach, in U.S. approach, if we get a Harris administration or a Trump 2 administration?
Yeah.
Do you anticipate any changes?
Well, I certainly don't anticipate a change under Harris. I think foreign policy-wise, everything that I'm reading, everything I'm seeing, it's going to be essentially more of the same. if you look at the national security strategy written by the Trump administration and look at the national security strategy of both immediately before and immediately after, when it comes to Northeast Asia policy, it's almost exactly the same. It's the importance of the alliances as a foundation. It's cooperate with China where we can, and compete and confront where we must. And I don't think that's going to change. Mr. Trump, of course, is a wild card. And he may get up one morning at 3 o'clock in his pajamas and tweet something that creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstanding. But at the end of the day, that's really not a change in U.S. policy. I tell people that the difference between Donald Trump and every president in my lifetime is that all other presidents have understood one simple fact. A president of the United States is not entitled to a personal opinion. Anything a president says is going to be interpreted both at home and especially abroad as a declaration of U.S. policy. I think the 4 years of the Trump administration demonstrated that that was not the case when it came to the president's tweets. This was his negotiating strategy. This was his style. This was his desire to rant and rave or whatever else. But it didn't always, or even seldom, result in an actual change in U.S. policy. So I feel fairly confident that policy will remain consistent regardless of who wins in November. I think anxiety levels will raise if Mr. Trump comes back. And ironically, the anxiety will be raised both in Taiwan and on the mainland, since neither one is particularly sure. And both, as well as most sane individuals, prefer some sort of continuity and predictability when it comes to American foreign policy. And that's what we hope for and strive for, and hopefully will continue to have.
Well, very good. Well, on these hopeful words, I guess, for hopeful continuity, I think we can call this to a close. Ralph, thank you so much for your insights. It has been, I think, very instructive, and I'm sure everyone will enjoy listening to you. And so we will end here. Thank you very much.
Good, David. Thank you. And tell everyone to go to our website and read the studies, the reports from the conferences, and also our When Taiwan Falls study, since I think it's very illuminating.
We'll add that on the link of the video. So
great.
Thank you, everyone.